We actually started this demonstration garden in 2020 whenever COVID happened. We knew a lot of our members were living in apartments or weren't being allowed to go to parks and those kind of things, and we had the space, so we wanted to set up the garden. And I'm really passionate about growing food, and so I really want to help other people grow food and be successful, because when I started, I was not. My first garden was very, very rough. I put plants in the ground. I maybe had like 5 jalapenos on something, and I never picked them because I was afraid to pick them because then I wouldn't have any. And so I really get excited about teaching people about growing food or flowers or whatever makes you happy. One thing I really want to do today is I want to make sure everybody leaves knowing somebody. So where is everybody from? Who's all from Lafayette? Anybody from Maurice? Or Youngsville? Abbeville? Anywhere? Where are you from? Breaux Bridge? Okay, there we go. So one of the biggest resources that you guys are going to have is someone local that grows next to you, because it's great. I love having the gym, but I have friends that grow in Church Point and Dusson and Butte La Rose, and it's like, man, the chances of me ever getting to spend a lot of time in your garden are so few. So I really hope that you meet somebody today that you can be friends with, that you can ask questions of, compare gardens, because that's really going to help you guys. The first thing on here, since we're talking about container gardening, is location. Actually, if you look in my garden, you can see I have far less containers than I do the raised beds, because containers dry out so very fast. Here in South Louisiana, like, we could have a week where it doesn't rain and it's plus 100-degree feeling, and then all of a sudden your plants are withered. And so for me, I have started migrating towards raised beds, but I understand that that's not feasible for everyone. Or maybe you move often, or you're in an apartment like Tyler is, and you really want to take advantage of that space. If at all possible, I'm going to encourage you to put your containers somewhere that it gets western shade. So, for example, here, the sun rises on this side and it sets over there. It would be really ideal, if my husband would let me do it, to put a garden right up next to that building. Because after lunchtime, it would start getting shade. It would get sun all morning, and then right about 2 o'clock, it would start getting shade in the vast heat of the day. I don't get to do that, but with containers, you have a lot of versatility. So in your yard, think about it and look about it. Think about where you want to put that raised bed or your container and what type of sun it gets. One of my biggest mistakes when I first started was I put it where it was right by my back door, but it was completely shaded. So I never got any sun and nothing grew because I never got sun. Hello. Here you go. No, you're all good. With that being said, you want to make sure that your plants are getting 6 to 8 hours of sun, 4 hours minimum for herbs, but you also want that to be somewhere that's going to be easily accessible, right? If I never walked by this garden, it would all die or be completely wild. So when you're thinking about your space, you want to put it somewhere that's also close to an area that you frequent, close to your back door, somewhere where maybe your kids play that you're at often. In my first home where I started gardening, if this was my house, we had a bedroom, our kitchen and living area was here, and our porch was here, and all of this was shaded. So my garden had to be over here, but I was never over here along this fence line between my neighbor and I. So my garden was right here, and if my kids wanted to be on the porch playing, and they were 1 and 3 at the time, I was always running back and forth or uncomfortable, or they had to come over here with me and it was hot and they never wanted to come. So try to find that balance between having a place where, here you go, ma'am, you want to grab one of these? Hey. Thank you. There you go. Try to find that balance between, oh, I've got plenty of copies. Oh, you had an extra one, perfect. Oh, try to find that balance between somewhere, if possible, that can get western shade, that you walk by relatively often. Hey, Miss Elizabeth. And would you like a paper for you? There you go, sweet girl. And somewhere that has water. If you have all these ideal circumstances of having this area gets western shade and it's right by my back door, but you don't have any water, you're gonna get really, really sick and tired of carrying a watering can in and out of your kitchen tons of times. So you've got to find that balance of what works for you, what's set up well. Maybe you're able to drag a water hose and you're like, I'm gonna leave this water hose right here. And then you run over it the first time that you mow or you weed eat and you're like, well, now I have no water. We all have to work within the circumstances that we have, but ideally we want to have western shade. We want to have accessibility to it often where we're seeing it, and a water source. The second thing would be thinking about what you want to plant. So I recommend planting something that everybody likes. I really love tomatoes. I really love peppers. I love all those things, and my husband doesn't eat any of them. He doesn't eat tomatoes, and he can't handle spicy things. So for my husband, he never went into my garden when I started gardening because he was not interested in any of those things. My husband loves melons and watermelons and cucumbers, and I don't eat melons, so I never grew melons when I started. So start with something that you enjoy because you're going to be much more likely to actually be growing it. And that's going to determine the size container that you need. I think that the biggest mistake that people make in container gardening is growing something in too small of a container and then being frustrated and thinking, oh, it doesn't work, I kill everything, but we actually just didn't give it the ideal circumstances that it needed to thrive. So on here, we've got a couple different options. We've got like 5-gallon buckets. Any type of container that's a plastic container that you flip over that says the HDPE with like a 2 inside of a triangle, that's gonna be a safe container for you to grow in that you know will last. Here you go. Hi. You're welcome. You could grow in terracotta pots. You could use cinder blocks. You could do wooden beds, wooden barrels, grow bags, metal beds, hay bales. My first garden actually started out of a compost pile that was kitchen scraps and leaves. And one day I walked out and something was growing and I was like, oh my gosh, what is this thing? There's this huge plant growing in it, and I had no clue what it was. And I was like, I didn't plant anything. I'm just throwing scraps. And I walked out and I had tons of new potatoes. And I had some potatoes that went bad that I threw in there and they just thrived. And I was like, I grew food, this is incredible. I was so excited. And then I was like, I can grow food, like, let's start a garden. That's literally how I got started in gardening. So don't neglect your compost piles. It's totally fine. And my compost pile was not anything fancy. I had 4 2x4 boards. I stuck little posts in the middle and I put chicken wire around it, and I just threw all the leaves in my yard in it every year. And then whenever I had scraps from the kitchen, I would put them in the freezer in a bag. When that bag got full and I couldn't put anything else in it, I'd go move some leaves, throw it in, cover it, and that was literally the extent of it. And I just let nature do its thing. So choose a container that's gonna work for you and be ideal for what you wanna grow. So when we look at the container size for different plants, on here I've just put a couple. This is actually a really good reference list for almost everything that's edible that you could grow. If you want to go to that link, you could search that. But this list I find is pretty good, but I would recommend, if possible, go larger on everything because we live in such a hot climate and the humidity. I would recommend going bigger. So for example, with beans, you could put 2 bean plants in a 10-gallon container. Cucumbers, you could do 1 compact variety in a 5-gallon bucket. If you have a 10-gallon container, you could do 2 to 3 vining plants. Melons need a 5-gallon bucket or larger, preferably larger. Tomatoes, it says 5-gallon bucket. You're gonna have to be watering that thing every day, being on top of it, and it's not gonna thrive. Like a 10 to 15-gallon, like one of those really large containers, is actually what's gonna be ideal for a tomato. Unless if you have 5-gallon buckets and you grow like a determinate variety. I actually grow a lot of determinates that are about 2 to 3 feet tall on the insides of my beds, and also some really small ones that are 12 to 18 inches around for kids. Yes, sir. So a determinate tomato is a tomato that's gonna grow to a determined height and size, and then it stops growing. Like a cherry tomato, if you've ever grown that, it's like sprawling out everywhere, right? Like it never stops growing. As long as you feed it, that thing will grow and it'll touch the ground and put down roots and just continue to grow. So a determinate variety is something that has a determined height and a determined amount of fruit. So like with a cherry tomato, as long as you keep feeding it, it can keep putting off tomatoes. Determinates are not like that. Like once it stops growing, it puts off all of its fruit and then it's done. Just take it out of the ground, plant something else. So I really like to do that if I'm growing with kids, because if you have small kids, they can't reach up high on a cherry tomato plant. So then they're tearing things or they're climbing in your bed. But with the two varieties that I have, the window box Little Bites cherry tomato gets about that tall, about that big around. It's a cherry tomato that's really easy for all little kids to just grab right there. The Tasmanian chocolate cherry gets about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, depending on how you feed it, and then it'll stop growing at that height. So for containers, determinate tomatoes are really gonna be more realistic unless you can give it a massive container. With squash, you could do 1 plant per 5-gallon bucket, preferably 7 to 10. Peppers the same. You could do 1 in a 5-gallon bucket, preferably bigger. I've seen some people, I'll look at their garden and I see like my pepper plants usually grow to the top of these little stakes right here, sometimes bigger. I've seen people whose pepper plants are like this tall because they give it that amount of space. They give it enough nutrition and space. The more that you pack plants in, they're gonna compete with each other and they're not going to grow to the prime that they really could. The other thing with containers that's super important here is drainage. I'm gonna borrow somebody's container here. Can I borrow one of y'all's containers? So in this container, I love that they have drain holes on the sides. Most containers, you'll see that they drill holes in the bottom, which is gonna let all the water run out. And if you were in a much more northern climate, I think that's totally fine. But here, like this container will dry out every single day in the summer, unless it has shade and a lot of mulch and it's not getting direct sunlight. So by putting these drain holes in the sides, you're gonna have about that much of water that sits in the end, and that might get you like 2 days in the summer if we don't have rain. So if you enjoy traveling, like my family's from Texas and I go to Texas often, I don't wanna not be able to leave because I have a garden. I wanna be able to go see my family. So putting these drain holes in the sides is gonna allow me to water really heavily. It's gonna run out the sides. It has a little bit of a reserve, and then I can come back. And if you find like, man, what I put in this is struggling, it's too wet, it's messing up, drill another hole lower. Drill a hole in the bottom. But once you have a hole in the bottom, it's really hard to like plug that hole and then come back and do something else. So I always recommend starting 2 to 3 inches up on a container and then going from there. Any questions so far? What you got, Mr. Gary? It should be passed around somewhere. Oh, Tyler's got it right there. There you go, bud. On to the next page. So this is about to be our fun part. We're gonna actually mix some soil. So for our containers, you do not wanna put topsoil, dirt in your containers. I have done that in some of my containers when I started, and within like 3 to 4 months, it is rock hard. It's dried out. It looks like the desert. There's cracks everywhere in it. Your plants aren't gonna thrive. So in a container, you really, really need to create a potting mix. You could either buy potting mix, which you're gonna find is really, really expensive, or we could make our own. Whenever we make our own, what I've got here is some compost, a little bit of topsoil. We're gonna add vermiculite to it, and then we're also gonna add some amendments, some blood meal, bone meal, different things like that. When it comes to making our own potting soil, one of the things, and growing in containers in general, one thing I think people miss the most is they don't feed them. Like we just think that we put our plant in, we put our mix in, it says it's got feed for 3 to 6 months. Well, that's if it's in a really large container and you're not really growing anything. But if you're growing peppers and tomatoes, like you might get 4 to 6 weeks out of that. And if you're not feeding it again after that, you're gonna start noticing that you don't get as many blooms, or your plant starts to turn yellow, or it starts having stress. And that's because it's used all the nutrition in that pot and then there's nothing else for it, especially if we have a smaller container. The smaller our container, the more that we water it and the more our plant grows, it's gonna deplete so much faster. So we've gotta make sure that we're putting nutrition into it to start, and then we fertilize it throughout the time. So let's everybody grab your pots, please. Grab your gloves if you like. We're gonna get our hands dirty. We're gonna mix up some soil, and we're gonna essentially do a little garden cooking. Alrighty, once you've got your 2/3 full of soil, you could use vermiculite or perlite, but we're gonna use this to fill our containers the rest of the 1/3 way to the top. So we've got our soil in, our vermiculite, now we need to add some nutrition. So if you look on the front of a bag, you got your nitrogen, phosphorus, and your potassium on there. Nitrogen is gonna be what makes your plants grow, like the green growth itself. The middle number is gonna be what helps your plants to flower. So if you notice like you're growing a tomato and you have this massive, beautiful tomato and you have no flowers at all, you're missing this middle number. The third number makes the plant grow strong, helps it uptake everything really, really well. So we're gonna add these to it. You could do this with a chemical fertilizer if you wanted to buy, I know some people use like 13 or other things like that. The reason that I don't use those is because they're really heavy in salts. And so it's gonna add things that I don't necessarily prefer. I would prefer using something that's like this. It's also, this you'll see whenever you open it up, this is really, really fine. So this isn't like a thick granule that's gonna be in there and kind of take a long time to break down. So when I'm doing a container, I put roughly a tablespoon per gallon of each of these things. I'm one of those cooks that I don't really measure. Like, I just kind of like, meh, you know, eyeball measure. But we're gonna want a tablespoon per gallon of the blood meal, of the bone meal, and then we've got our potash. This one is a much higher number, so you could probably cut that number in half or something like this. If you don't have something like this, you could also use a general like a Joby's or something like that. I also have in my vehicle alfalfa pellets. That's something that you feed to animals, but it's really high in nitrogen and other trace minerals. I'll put alfalfa pellets on the top, wet it so that they kind of crumble, and then I'll mix that in as well. So you can use more than one thing. My preferred thing, if possible, is to use broken down manure. Compost. Rabbit manure can go straight in. It doesn't have to be composted at all. You just have to be careful if you have a lot of pine shavings, that can change the pH of your container. Composted cow manure or horse manure can be used, composted chicken manure. So back in the day, whenever old timers were growing, what they did is they went to their chicken coop or their stalls in the barn and they shoveled things out, mixed it with their soil, and grew in it. Not a ton of us have barns and stalls and all of those things, so that is why they have things like this. But if you don't have it, find somebody that does. My friend Dayton here has rabbits, and so Dayton brings me rabbit manure. Actually, at the gym we have one of our kids members, his dad has cows, and so I hire him I pay him $5 per bucket of cow manure that he shovels, and his dad brings when he comes to class. So he's learning some skills. He's taking a byproduct of what they do and turning it into income. So you don't have to be like, I have to have cows and I have to have chickens and I have to have all the things. Sometimes you just have to know somebody, and sometimes those people, they might have rabbits, but they don't want to have a huge garden like I have a huge garden. Or someone has chickens and they're like, I like having eggs, but I don't like cleaning this thing out. Hey, I'll clean your thing out for free if I can have it. And find those connections and those things so that you don't rely on these things. Because like I went today and they were completely sold out of blood meal, like completely out. And it's like, okay, well, if I didn't have that, what would I do? And that's using natural things. You can also use right over here, this black container is a compost tumbler. So I have a big compost pile at home that's like I talked about before. That's just leaves, it's grass clippings, it's food, coffee grounds, all those kind of things. But here, I'll take all of my spent plants. When they come out, if they're not diseased, they go in there. Whenever kids are in the garden and they have apple cores, they go in there. I take all of the little coffee pods, that goes in there. All those things, and we turn it, and you would be surprised by how incredible of compost can come out of that. If you want to go check it out later, on the right is finished compost that I've left in there. You'll still see some eggshells in there, but it's very broken down. On the left, you can open it up and you'll see everything. All the spent things that were in the garden that goes in there all the time, and you spin it. So even if you're in a place that you're like, I don't want to have a pile, I have dogs or I have cats and I don't want them to get into it, this might be an option for you. So in our containers, I'm going to do a tablespoon per gallon of these, and with this one, I'm going to do half on that number because it's so high. And granted, you might find I kind of fertilize everything the way I would if I was doing tomatoes and peppers because they're really heavy feeders. And it's hard for me to remember, like, these are fertilized really well. These are not as much. I fertilize it like I would if I'm doing something really heavily, and then if not, they just get extra and I have more leeway, and I call that good. So we'll take your container. You are welcome to use some of these little measuring things or do the eyeball method. And then when you're done and you mix all that stuff together, I'm going to take my pot and literally just mix it. And I'm just going to stick my hands in and work all the things together until it looks like a really fine, well-blended container. When I mix this all the way through containers, my roots aren't going to stay at the top. My roots are going to grow all the way down. And as they grow down, I want them to have nutrition also. So some people will say when they do their containers, they will mix it like this, they'll dump it out, leave 2/3, then they'll add like a granular fertilizer and then put the rest on top. So that when the roots get down there, they're like, I'm lazy, I'm going to forget, I'm just going to safeguard against myself. You could do something like that if you wanted to. It's just a lot more work. You got to have another bucket, something like that. But that is something that you can do. This is specific to containers because we need this in containers. Down here, this soil is touching the ground. So as I'm putting things in it, earthworms and all those things are going to be working up underneath there. As I add things on the top, it's going to continue breaking down. You'll notice I have leaves on the top. That is to keep the sun from burning the top of my soil. Just like how we put something in the oven and that heat bakes it, the same thing happens with the sun. It will bake the top of your container. So we're going to make sure once we get our plant, we're about to pick some plants. I also have bags of leaves that we're going to use to mulch the top of that container. You can mulch it with leaves, you can mulch it with pine straw. Some people use straw or hay, but you run the risk of it being full of weed seeds and then you grow tomatoes and grass. So I don't prefer that option. Depending on what you have, you could put like small pebbles on top, but then it could get mixed in as you mix things in. So I prefer the leaves and the straw because that's going to break down into the pot. I leave that in there. I don't take any of these leaves and stuff out. It just becomes dirt and it just goes back into it. Also, so when we talk about watering, we're gonna pick a plant, we're gonna put it in, and we wanna water it. I wanna make sure we're not just watering like with the hose, with that long, really hard thing that comes out. Because what is gonna happen is if I do that, it's gonna make a tunnel down in the middle of my soil, and essentially it's gonna make these pockets in my soil. You'll notice where sometimes how you water, there's a puddle and it just sits. Well, that means it's too compacted and it's not seeping down evenly. Or when that happens, you poke a hole in it, all the water drains through that hole, right? Well, the water is coming down through that hole, but it's not evenly dispersing through the roots of my plant. So when I water, I like to use a little attachment. Let me show you right here. So I'll use something like this that makes like a shower end. Because ideally, we want to be doing something like mimicking rain, which it rains like hard here. Sometimes it rains like hurricanes. But I want to be doing something that's light so that it's evenly moistening the soil at the top, and then it's going to moisten it evenly down. If I just stick a water hose in this thing and I'm doing it around, I'm making little compaction spaces and tunnels that I don't want to have in my container. We also want to be watering deeply. So if I come out every single day and I water the top of the container and I never see water come out the bottom, the roots are going to grow to where the water is because that's how they stay hydrated. So if I just really shallowly water every single day, then I'm gonna have really shallow roots and my plant is not gonna be as strong. But if I water it with that light setting all the way until I see water come out the bottom, then I know that it's getting watered all the way down and my roots are gonna grow all the way down because it's gonna dry out from the top down. The sun is on the top and it's gonna dry the top and work its way down. But if I've only ever watered this top portion, my roots are gonna stay up there. And then I have a lot more chance of losing my plant. So by watering deeply till I see it run out the sides of my containers, I know that the whole thing has been watered well and that my roots are gonna grow down there. Once we do this, if you need to, right now you can get out your phone, you can set an alarm for pick any day 6 to 8 weeks from now that says fertilize my containers, because your plant is going to use the nutrition in this container within 6 to 8 weeks. If you're growing a pepper or tomato, probably more like 4 to 6 weeks if they're growing well. So I'm one of those people, just like I set an alarm to work out at the gym or to do any of the things that I know I need to do, because if I'm like, oh, I'll remember it, you won't. Somebody will get sick, something will happen, you'll go on vacation, and then in 2.5 months, you'll be like, oh, what happened to my container? Like, it was growing so well and now it's not doing it, but you stopped feeding it, and so it's not continuing to grow. Some other options for amending that, and I've used all of these different options. Kelp meal is something that you can add on top. And one thing that I prefer to do, is I use really small numbers whenever I fertilize. I don't want to use something like a 13, 13, 13 because that's gonna burn your plants if you don't do it well. So I would prefer, like, I err on the side of, I don't always know what I'm doing, but I'm trying. So let's make sure I don't do something really silly. So I would use something like that. You can also fertilize with something like the fish emulsion. That's a 511. This is much more high in the nitrogen, like your plant growing, but you can use this, mix like an eyeball, shake like boop, in a whole gallon watering can, and then water your plants with it. If you have plants inside, please don't water your inside plants with this, because I've done that and our house smelled like dead rotting fish. And it was bad. I was like, I had seedlings inside and they were they needed to be up potted. And I was like, oh, they don't have any more nutrition, I'm gonna water them. And I watered them outside, and then I brought them in that night and I woke up and I was like, the plumbing's not working, like something. Don't water anything that's gonna come inside with this. You will regret it. This is a bag of worm castings. I also have a worm container. All of these things can be put in the top. Like, you could just work this in that top little bit of your soil. Just scratch the top, like when you have your leaves, pull your leaves back, scratch the top a little bit, put it in and work it into the top of your soil. And then as you water it, it's gonna fertilize that way. If you wanna do something like using Joby's or a granular tomato and all-purpose fertilizer, you can do that. Work it into the top of your container and make sure it's not just sitting on the top. I also have right here, this is something I've used before when I didn't have access to other things. This is a poultry manure. Chicken manure is actually a hot manure. So I don't want to take a ton of this and throw it right on the base of my plants. This is something that, like, I would work into a whole container if I didn't have these other things, but I'm not going to throw this right at the base of a plant because I think these numbers are just a little bit too much for that. Other thing, I'm trying to think of anything else. Oh, the alfalfa meal, that's something, if you use alfalfa pellets, you can totally do that. They're easier to store because if it falls out, it's pellets that you could pick up instead of, like, when that worm casting bag busted, it's just, it all looks like dirt. It's really hard to get back. If you do something like that, put it on the top and water it, let it sit for a day or two, because then it'll break that pellet down and then you can work it into the soil. In raised beds like this, I don't come and, like, I kind of do this stuff all willy-nilly. I'll pull the leaves back and I just grab it and I'm like, just sprinkle all of the soil a little bit with the things. And then I'm not a uber, like, it must be measured exact. How many, square feet do I have? So I sprinkle that in, I mix it to the top couple inches of my soil, and I water it in. And with something like this, I tend to go with more of the, like, rabbit manure, my compost that I can just add on top. the alfalfa meal, and I save things like this for like a small container that I want to be more exact on. But that's totally up to your discretion. Any questions on that?
So you can use manure instead of the kelp meal? It's like either or kind of thing to spread on top?
So if it's rabbit manure, I would say yes. You still want to work it into the top couple inches of your soil. You don't want to necessarily leave it sitting on the top. With something like the chicken manure, definitely work that in. Don't leave that be sitting onto the top. And I only use this when I can work it into the whole container. Like I don't typically use that at the very top. I would use that in replace of some of these other things. So let's go. We're gonna all pick something off the trailer. Over there, I have cherry tomatoes, I have Creole tomatoes, I have banana peppers, marigolds, zinnias, basils, and there's some Coleus. The little dark purplish black flowers are really shade tolerant things. So if you have a really shady spot in a small container, Coleus would be your thing. Remember, if you're doing a tomato or a pepper, you really need at least 5 gallons or more, or else it's gonna be pretty stunted. So just know if you put it in something smaller than that, don't come be like, this thing did not grow. You didn't give it the space it needed, okay? So let's all go pick a little container or a little plant we'll put in there. Our soil really, really well. I'm gonna use you guys as an example if you don't mind. So I have it lightly on. It's not wild and crazy and super hard, but I'm gonna water it and I'm gonna work it in because this water will tend to sit at the top, and I wanna make sure that I'm working it in everything. But you also don't bring a massive container because this is gonna get heavy once we water it. I'm gonna water it. I'm gonna let that water drain down, work it in, make sure that it's getting everything nice and moist. And if I have a tomato, can I borrow your tomato? Tomatoes are really special, and that has all these little furry things, and you can see there's actually like a little root on there. This will put out roots as deep as I plant it. So my first tomato I ever put, like I put in the ground like this, and then it really struggled because I didn't give it proper soil. But I can plant this thing as deep as my container is. Like I can take these off, or I could leave them on and just plant the whole thing, and it will put out roots everywhere that I plant it. So you'll start noticing towards the later in the season, you'll be like, I have all these weird white things growing on the base of my tomato. That's because it's rain and water and soil has touched it, and it's like, let me grow, like I want to grow. So you can plant your tomatoes deeply. Everything else I typically plant at the top of the soil. Like I might put a little bit more soil on top of this, but you don't have to, these things won't grow extra roots. So no problem with that, but make sure you water your container also because this soil is gonna settle a little bit. It's really light and fluffy until you put water in it, and then it's gonna settle some. So if you can, please share the water hose. We'll do all of this. We'll do this part towards the end because I wanna cover just a couple of other things. With these things, you can stake and trellis anything. I don't want you to think you have to go to the store and you have to buy whatever trellising thing they have. I have these fancy trellises because they were on the side of the road by somebody's trash can, and I picked them up. I would not go pay $50 for one of these because they're just not as sturdy. They're not going to hold as much. I really, really like cattle panels and those kind of things because I actually use these to grow melons and really large squash and really, really heavy things. But you can use anything. You can use a T-post. The sticks you see in the back behind my composter were also on the side of the road, and I really want to grow a bean teepee for my kids, and so I picked them up and I'm going to run string around them. You could use PVC pipes. You can grow things up, a chain link fence if you have it. Bed frames, like when people have little headboards and bed frames, like you can totally repurpose all of those things. So be creative with that stuff. And then at the end, so if you have something like tomatoes, you can come to your tomato, you can shake that thing. It has male and female parts in that same plant, so just by shaking it, it's going to be pollinated. With almost anything else, like your peppers and your peppers are a little bit different, but with squash and things, If your male and female flowers never get pollen, you're not going to get squash. So in your container gardens, I really want to make sure you've got flowers somewhere. If you put them in a pot, great. If you don't, you plant them on the ground. Have flowers, because if not, you're going to have to do a lot of the pollinating yourself. If you don't ever have bees in your garden, chances are all of your squash is going to shrivel up and die. All of my first squash grew, it looked real pretty, and then all of a sudden I came out the next day and it was nothing. And I didn't plant a single flower in my garden, so I had no bees. Sir? You can use marigolds. A lot of people plant them with their tomatoes. I have a lot of the Indian blanket. You'll see those pink and yellow flowers. Those things, they grow in the cracks of our sidewalks. And so they're a native plant that's really drought tolerant that will grow almost anywhere. So instead of the Indian blanket, these pink and yellow flowers. So I prefer to put flowers in that will die that will live if I don't do anything, as opposed to really something needy or something that's going to take space in my container. If I was only doing containers, I would be planting seeds for something like that, because it'll grow in the side of our concrete. Like I said, it wants to be here. It's from here. You could do that. Also, I want to make sure that you're checking your containers often. Like I said with location, if you put it somewhere that you don't check it often, it's really problems come faster with a container. In my raised bed, I've got more space. It gives me a little bit more leeway because I have extra soil. It can pull nutrients from somewhere else. But in a container, once it dries out and gets bone dry, it's tough to return from those things if you're not checking on it and being diligent. And also with harvesting, one of the first mistakes that I made as a beginner gardener was not knowing anything about how long my plants would take to have food. And so when I planted, in this garden, I had about 5-6 varieties of peppers last year. All of them were producing except one. And I kept looking at this pepper something's wrong with you. What's going on? Why aren't you doing your job? You're not giving me anything. And I was so frustrated with this pepper. I was really looking forward to it. And I was just it's not doing anything. I want to rip it out and I want to put something else in. And then I went and looked at my seed pack, and that pepper takes 120 days to produce peppers, whereas my other ones were all 85 to 90 days. And so they were giving me peppers a month, a whole month before my other peppers. But I had this expectation that you should all give me something at the same time. So if you're starting something from seed, or if you buy something from the nursery and you have that label on it, look at it and get an idea. That way, that will also help you to troubleshoot things. If I know that this tomato should be producing something within another 60 days after I put it in the ground, and I'm 120 days in, maybe I don't have enough of that middle number on my thing, and I need to make sure that I'm putting something on there to get flowers and not just a ton of nitrogen. So having that idea of when to harvest and not being afraid to harvest. So I also, like I told you at the beginning, I didn't pick hardly any of my peppers because I was I only have 5 on this little tiny plant. I don't want to pick them. And with a plant, what happens is inside each of these fruits and vegetables are little tiny seeds, and the plant's job is to produce seeds so that it can reproduce. So if I have something on there and I never pick it, that plant knows we're getting ripe. I don't have to produce anything else because this is going to get ripe. It's going to fall on the ground and I'm going to have another thing. I'm good. The same with flowers. You can look at those yellow flowers on the corner there, my calendula. When all these flowers bloom and then they start to die, if I don't pull those heads off, it's going to stop producing flowers because it's done its job. It's gone to seed. It's good. But if I keep pulling those heads off, the plant is I must reproduce, make more flowers. I've got to keep doing this. So by harvesting, you're actually going to get more from your plant than you didn't. With the basils, if you never pull basil off, that stem is going to get really hard and woody. Your basil is going to get a different taste, and it's going to stop growing and it's going to start producing flowers. You'll see a long little thing that has a bunch of little flowers on it, and that is I'm going to seed because I want to reproduce. When you pinch those off, every time you pinch those off, it's going to keep trying to grow because that plant wants to go to seed. So don't be afraid to eat what you've got on there. Don't be afraid to harvest it. And also with containers, if you find that you're having trouble with drainage in your containers, you can do things like add sticks in the bottom or add rocks or something like that to help with drainage in a container. I also, don't be afraid if you have containers at home that you're like, yeah, this didn't work because I put dirt in it, and that's exactly why none of this is working. Take a bucket, pour it out, get you some vermiculite, get you some compost and manure, mix those things together and make it a little better every time and start again. These containers right here, I have this plant, this one had a massive big cranberry hibiscus in it, and it won't go anywhere because the root has grown into the ground. It's so massive, and I've left this thing in here because it's going to decompose and break down in there. I'm just going to plant something else and let that continue to break down. So when you put these containers in the ground, that nutrition, every time you water it, is also going to go into the ground. So you might notice if you have it on grass, like, the grass around my container is really green, and that's because it's getting some nutrition. You might also find things growing out of the bottom of your containers because there's more nutrition there and it wants to grow. If you have problems with, say, you have back issues or knee issues, you can always put these up on blocks to raise them up instead of having to buy a bigger container. Keep the container you have, put it up on blocks. It makes it easier for you to access whatever is going to help you want to go out in the garden. Do it so that you can continue doing that. Other things on here, the last thing we've got down here is growing resources and our pest prevention. I'll be super honest. This garden, we have a lot of kids and adults that come through the garden, and the kids pick out of it every day and they eat it right off the plant. They don't wash it, so I don't put anything on my plants. You could use BT, you could use neem oil for pests, things like that. I don't even put organic products on it because my kids are going to come out and they're going to pick it and they're going to eat it. And diatomaceous earth, other things are organic and natural and you could use them. I just choose not to. So I plant a lot in this garden knowing that things are going to get eaten. Caterpillars are going to eat things, bugs are going to eat things, and I'm okay with that because I want kids to be able to come out and eat freely. If you choose to use something, so when people are like, hey, what do I do about this? Like, honestly, I don't know because I just know that it's going to happen, and I'm kind of okay with it. One thing for like tomato hornworms, if you really want something cool with your kids, if you find that your tomato plants are getting eaten, you can take a black light and come out at night and hornworms glow. And it's really, really cool with kids. They'll get super excited to do that. When I see a caterpillar, I pinch it off and I smush it and kids are like, ah, you touched it. I know other people that when they come out for stink bugs, they don't like touching them and smushing them, so they vacuum them with like a hand vacuum. They will legit come out and like hand vacuum stink bugs. Whatever you got to do. I realize when I grow, I'll have sometimes people come say like, oh my gosh, this has holes in it, I can't eat it. But to me, that means like, it's okay and it's natural. Like if something has a hole in it, wipe that bug off and eat it. It's just a little more protein. You're totally fine. If I come out and I see everything is perfectly fine, there's no holes in anything, that tells me they've heavily put something on everything and it needs to be washed really well or stoked really well, and I just don't have time for those things. So I acknowledge that there are bugs. There are some things that you'll need to take care of, and you could do that. There are copper fungicides and other things you could use. Use that at your own discretion. I'm not a great resource for that because I'm like, it happens. Plant earlier, harvest often, those kind of things. That's it for the class. It's 9:35. I tried really hard. Or wait, we still have time. We're going till 10, right? Okay, good. Perfect. So that's mainly it for what I've got teaching-wise. I want to make sure that I'm answering any questions you guys have, and I'd love for you to come try some things in the garden. I also have, I've got a couple of things that I have pulled out of my garden. Like this is an hoja santa plant, and a lot of people in Hispanic culture will take these leaves and they will bake fish in them. Like how, you do tamales with like banana leaves, they'll bake fish and other things in these. I pulled a bunch up. I have tons of those things. I have some other Mexican sunflowers taking over, and I would love for y'all to come pull some little babies out of there and take them home and plant them at your house. Perfect. Yeah. So I would love for y'all to try that once we're done, but I want to answer any questions that you guys have or attempt to answer any questions you have. I don't know all the things, but I will try.
We got y'all containers. In here, all I've done is I've put down cardboard. So on this section,
I left it open so that you could see what happens. This had cardboard underneath it, and it's virtually grassless. Like there's still a couple of things that are trying to creep underneath, but putting down
2 or 3 layers of cardboard is gonna kill that grass. You could till it, you could take it out. That's just a lot of work that I don't find to be as necessary.
It's not going to generally, if you have that much soil, it's not going to go too far into the ground anyway, right? Like,
Well, it's not.
gonna stay
It's going to stay in this container, and doing this, it's going to, when I put down my 2 layers of cardboard, that's going to break down in a year or so. Earthworms are going to start eating this thing, and the way I do it is I will put cardboard, these bags of leaves, I'll fill this thing halfway full with leaves, and then I'll put soil on top of it, water it in, and I'll put something like tomatoes in a bed like this because I know that those leaves are going to continue breaking down, and here in a couple months, like what was full like this is going to be like this, and then I need to add more soil. So when I add more soil on top, those tomatoes are just going to put out more roots. So that's typically what I prefer to do with a new bed. Like I'll put things like tomatoes in it that I can keep filling soil in as I need to go. Yep, the roots will keep coming out, but those leaves are going to turn into soil eventually. And I like to do that because if I have to fill this whole thing with soil, that's going to take me forever. Like, or I'm going to spend a lot of money doing it. And so leaves are free. I can fill this thing halfway through with leaves. Some people put sticks in their beds. I don't do that. But by putting leaves down, you can put your kitchen scraps in. You can put your composted manure in it. Put topsoil in it, and then put the top, I like to do, say the top like this much with like a really decent, like you could either put black cow or compost if you have it, whatever you have access to, and just layer that thing, and as it goes down, then you can just, it's really easy to spend a good amount of money on quality something when I need 3 to 4 inches of it versus if I need 12. Yeah, and actually with the raised beds that are over there, the cinder block beds, my first year, those were 1 layer tall. And so they were 1 layer the first year because I put quality soil in it. At 6 inches, I'm not going to put a ton of leaves because nothing's really going to grow in 4 inches of soil well, other than maybe lettuce and a couple things. The reason that I double stack them, we'll come right over here, is for a couple of reasons. Help themselves, they did whatever they wanted to. And I also found that I had a lot more problem with the grass growing up in my bed on the edges. Like you can see here,
like just right here, I have all of these weeds. Well, this is significantly easier for something
like this to climb over something shorter. Also, tomatoes need a good depth. Like they really need like 12 to 18 inches in a pot to be able to grow. So when I had it single layered, I had to give so much more space because the roots needed it. And I really like lush and full and really big gardens. You'll notice I don't cover the top of these, and that's because when I find trash, it goes in the hole. Or when I have a rogue pot, it goes in the hole. Anything like that, I put it in the hole. At the end of the week, I can come clean it out. Some people prefer to plant in the edges, and that's totally fine. I don't, because I want people to be able to come and to be able to sit. Like if they're tired or if they want to help me weed, like have a seat. Because bending over weeding, that's rough, right? Like have a seat. If you want to harvest something from the middle, I don't want you struggling. Like have a seat and do something. These blocks are actually here because we have kids in the garden, and I want kids to be in the garden. So I grow things like this, this one actually has chrysanthemum melons planted at the bottom. So melons will grow up here. This one is going to have cucumbers. This one has large Lakota squash. That one will have a Trumancino squash. And I want kids to be able to come and step right here and step right here and pick cucumbers off. And if I don't,
they're going to try to climb, and I did not reinforce these, so these
could technically, if someone was rough,
fall over.
So I want it to be
a kid-friendly space. Having this much soil, you can tell, last year, these were almost full. And you can
see there's a good 2 to 3 inches there that they've dropped. So they'll continue dropping every year. And if you're pulling your plants out, every time you pull a plant out, you're pulling soil out too. So I cut them at the top, plants around it, but it's still going to be used up, wind, all the things, erosion. So I like to add a little bit every year put my leaves in, I leave it, and I won't take these out. At the end of the year, whatever leaves are left in here, I'm just going to cover over and I'm going to work it all in. Because if you dig far enough down, you'll find massive worms in there and all kind of life and things. Any other questions about raised beds? Anything like that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Have you ever amended it? Mm-hmm. Mushroom compost? Mm-hmm. Did you do anything else after that? Probably void of nutrition. So I pH test them often, like every time I replant, because these are in cinder block. I don't know the pH things for wood versus this versus metal, but I test it every year because also the things that you grow will take different things out of your soil. I amend every planting hole when I put things in. So when things go in this bed, I take a scoop of that compost and it goes in the bottom of the hole and I put it in. I put a little bit of that compost around and I plant it. So I am always like overly throwing fresh compost in the garden to make sure that there's nutrition in there. Yeah, you can do pH test strips, or you could also send it off to the Ag Center, right? I think the LSU Ag Center, you can send them soil and they'll test it and send it back, and it's really like legit and scientific and all those things if you're into that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Add leaves, add compost if you can, whatever you can, and then amend it. Yes, ma'am. For sure. I want y'all all to try this.
This is my kids' favorite thing in the garden. One of my favorite things about growing my own food is that I can
try things that are not available to me at the grocery store. Don't be scared. So this sweet little gentleman right here was actually in the garden with me 2 weeks ago, and he tried every single thing that was growing in the garden. Literally everything. So this is a spinach that literally tastes like a lemon. When you bite it, it tastes like a lemon. The stem is like the juiciest lemon without, everybody's got to try it. Now that I said it tastes like a lemon, y'all are like, oh, okay, maybe I'll try that then.
Did you plant for sale this year? I did, yeah.
Isn't that
so good?
Isn't that good? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I put, so what's that called? This is sorrel.
I put it in every single bed. There's some more, y'all can pass it around to try. These two plants have actually been in here since last March. And this is a green, like I have it over here. I have it in almost every bed because I don't want, my kids will eat like a whole plant down in a day and then it won't grow back. But this is something that grows year round for me. These have been in here since March. And
that middle bed they've been in there, I'm just replanting it here.
So this is a salad green that we make salads with, and we don't even add dressing. We come out here and we have sorrel, we'll pick
cherry tomatoes off,
we'll pick cucumbers off, we'll pick peppers, throw them together and just eat them out of the garden fresh with a little dirt and extra minerals on them.
These are peas.
I've never seen it at a nursery. I grow it from seed. Yes, ma'am. I start these from seed.
This right here, that is lettuce.
Yes, sir, that is a lettuce. Yep. If you search sorrel seeds, a ton of things will come up. Things like Baker Creek will come up, Southern Exposure Seed Exchange, a ton of places will come up for that. Yes. But I like to find things that grow well here. For example, the sorrel, this is the only green, like I have a
lettuce here that he was pointing out that I left in here because this is going to seed.
Everyone thinks like, I eat salad in the summer, like that's when I want to grow lettuce, and they're like, this lettuce doesn't grow for me. It's a cold
weather thing.
This I can grow year round and we can eat. If I grow it out, you'll see right there on the back of that trellis, you see to the right of that trellis, there's like a tall thing that looks kind of like this. That is that plant going to seed because this is like southern for us. So the one on the left was planted at the same time and it's fine, but it gets shade. It gets a lot more shade than the others do. So I plant them all throughout the garden under trellises, on the north side of sunflowers, things like that. And I have it all year round. I also found varieties for It's called Reverend Morrow's Longkeeper Winter Storage Tomato. Like there's a Louisiana heirloom tomato that they say it can sit on your counter for 200 days without going bad. And it's like, why don't I know that? Like, why isn't it locally sold, like bred in Siberia, and they can grow down to like 10 degrees? So I've grown them all throughout the winter before. Peppers, like everyone thinks grow peppers in the spring. I put peppers in every spring, and then I regret it by June and July, and come September, every pepper it puts off is beautiful and massive and gorgeous, and all the peppers that went through the summer are like stunted and shriveled because the heat is just so much. But I know that, and I keep doing it anyways, like even though I know better. But there are so many varieties and things that you can try when you're growing them yourself. Yeah. And I recommend, if possible, finding a local nursery, because those people are going to spend more time talking to you, explaining to you how to plant things. They're going to ship to all the lows, right? Our growing zone is not like anybody else's growing zone. Like this isn't like Texas, and we're not like Florida, and we're not California. Like it's just different. And so local nursery growers will grow things that they know that work. They're not going to grow things like sorrel and like exciting things. You might have to start that from seed, or urban naturalists might carry it. But they're going to grow things that you know will grow in our area, versus if you go get it at a big box store, it might, but it may not be the most adaptable to our area. Anybody else got questions? The window box tomatoes?
That's one that I also got from seed.
Yes, I am. Almost everything in the garden, I start from seed, with the exception of some of the flowers. But like this started out as one teeny plant right there that spilled out there, that's growing here, that's growing in the walkways. Like I never have to plant that. It's a native flower to our area. I don't water them in the walkway either, and they just keep growing. Whereas the zinnias are so pretty, but they are so needy. You have to water them all the time. They dry up very quickly. These things, like, they want to be here. They've been here before we were here. They're going to be here after we're here. That will always be in my garden, whether I want it to or not now. Yes. Anybody else? Any other questions? This right here is the Mexican mint marigold, or the Mexican torch sunflower, I'm sorry. And I would love for y'all to come scoop some out and take some, because it's going to take over my garden. I'll actually take one out right here. So whenever I take plants out, I'll scoop out a little bit of soil, and you can see the roots are there. So I don't just pull them out. I kind of go around the sides and just tease the thing out like that. Would anybody like some? Yeah, there you go. Absolutely. Take you some, because it's like I'm trying to grow this tomato and it's like being ridiculous over there.
Is there a technique to pulling off basil?
I just pinch it.
Like from the top or from the bottom? Just from the top.
You want to grab your basil real quick? Hey, friend. Make sure before you leave, I want y'all to grab some leaves from those bags and cover your container. We want to make sure that it's mulched and it's going to be able to save some water. Did Daddy feed you? Okay, baby. I'll be there in just 1 second. So
Like with something like basil, if you look right here, it's got these little babies that are growing there. Whenever we harvest it, we'll harvest these bigger leaves off to eat. And anywhere that I pinch this thing where it has one of those branches, it will make more growth come off from that. So if I come and I pinch that right there, these are going to put out more growth in that area. So you can pinch off this whole thing and eat this, and you can see we've got a big leaf, a medium-sized leaf, and smaller leaves, and it's just going to keep producing like that with basil. Yeah, you can take your basil home. If you've never had a basil mozzarella grilled sandwich, grilled cheese, they're so good. That's my kid's favorite way to eat basil. Anybody else? Anybody got questions? What you got? No. So I'll come pull off of this thing all the time. And like I said before, if I just leave this thing here, it'll go to seed so fast. So anytime I see flowers, I'll pinch them off. But we're constantly harvesting on basil for it to go in pastas or sandwiches or pesto to make sure that it keeps growing. Because if not, this will get really woody. Yeah, the reason I don't want it to go to seed is because this whole stem will get super, super woody. The basil won't taste as fresh, it won't be as good, and then it'll stop producing basil and just make flowers.
Okay, so when you get flowers, you take them off.
Pinch those things off. And they don't look like a flower like this.
Right.
It looks like a little, it'll look like that, like a real tall little thing. You'll see it and you'll be like, you are not a leaf. You see that thing's not a leaf, pinch it off. But you could keep getting basil all year long if you keep pinching that thing. It's going to keep trying to go to seed. Once it does go to seed, if I have one that, like, if I look and I see the stalk is woody and it's got a lot of stuff on it, I'll leave that one plant because bees love it. They're so, so good for the garden. And things like basil flowers are actually really pretty to add to arrangements. They make your arrangement smell good. Like, they add color to them if you're growing Thai basil, things like that. So you don't necessarily have to view it just as something edible, but it could be something pretty to go in your arrangements too. And for the bees.
We're talking the flowers on tomatoes.
Mm-hmm.
I know you shake the cherry tomato ones,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't pinch those off.
No. Yeah, with the tomatoes, you can see, like, this is an example of a determinate tomato, and these are those window box cherry tomatoes. They'll grow a little bit bigger than this, but if I come out and I shake this thing, it's going to pollinate those flowers, and all of those little flowers are going to make a tomato. If I pull those off, I'm essentially pulling off the fruit. Yeah. But say if I had one of those, if I had a tall tomato that I'm going to plant, if it's this tall and I'm planting half of it and I'm going to make it this tall and it has flowers, I'll pull those off so that it'll spend its energy growing. And then once it gets, say, about yay tall, I let them keep the tomatoes on there because it'll still grow and produce tomatoes. But if I put it in when it's this tall and I have like a beefsteak tomato and it has a bunch of flowers on it, well, it's going to try to grow tomatoes and not spend time growing the plant itself, which would give me more tomatoes. Anybody else? Anything I need to add? Subtract? It's 9:59. Woo! Hey, there we go. No, this is my first gardening class. Definitely not a pro. You can look around my garden and be like, that lettuce is going to seed and that's going to seed. If you come to my garden, and y'all are welcome to come by, stop by anytime, check things out, look around. I intentionally let a lot of things go to seed because I like to save seeds and share them. Seeds are kind of expensive, especially like if all I want is sorrel. Well, then I have to pay like for sorrel and for shipping, or I have to buy other things. So like there's lettuce going to seed, we've got dill going to seed, all kind of things going to seed. But y'all are welcome to stop by and check it out, look around and be like, this is doing that, like maybe mine's not, or yes, it is, and I'm always here. So you'll see me out in the garden quite often. Yeah, absolutely, go for it.